Now it checks an update on the embattled New Hanover County Board of Elections.
The board asking for $75,000 in additional funding from the county. It comes as a third-party firm paid by the county continues to review the board following November's election. Our media partner, Port City Daily, first broke the news of the request. WECT's Connor Smith joins us now with more details. Connor, is that county sanctioned review connected at all to this request?
Well, Fran, not exactly, but it's another example of the tense back and forth between the two sides over the last few months. And from the board's perspective, funding has been at the center of that. The $75,000 going to extra employees needed this fall. There were roughly 20 of them. They reviewed absentee ballots and helped with curbside voter traffic. The Board of Elections says shorter windows to return absentee ballots along with high curbside voting numbers led to the hires. Of course, the Elections Board put under the microscope after it was revealed they didn't count roughly 2,000 absentee ballots for over a week after election night. Board leaders then arguing they needed more funding. The county's chief financial officer approved this request back in September. The total amount then revealed in an email sent a few weeks ago. In an email to the county's chief financial officer and assistant county manager, Board of Elections Director Ray Hunter Haven says in part, quote, "To ensure that we had adequate support to execute all critical tasks, we had to increase the number of temporary employees that we contracted. This unplanned operational need occurred because of several converging factors which significantly changed the landscape of absentee and early voting during this election." Now, we also reached out with questions for County Manager Chris Crudre and Board of Elections Chair Derek Miller, both declining to speak with us today. John.
Connor, you've also learned the status of that third-party review. What is that looking like since the Board of Elections already told us they're not participating in it at all?
Well, Fran, a county spokesperson tells me today it's been harder to complete that review, but lawyers are reviewing internal communications, meeting materials, and interviewing other county employees. We're expecting to get results by the end of this month.
All right, Connor, thanks.